Okay, so thank you so much for having me here. So I work in a university archives and records setting, very institutional, but some of this is informed with some previous work I've done in Africa, and mostly it came out of a seminar that I took with Bruce last fall. So I'm not Bruce. Bruce is a cryptographer. He's doing something kick-ass in Europe right now, so he couldn't be here. But he gave a seminar on existential risk last fall, and it's the kind of place where we had the privilege of just showing up. It wasn't for credit, and I got to sit in a room full of people who were really smart, working on a lot of really exciting and weird stuff, and so this came out of that seminar. So I'm going to explore the feasibility of the pursuit of digital archives in a world simultaneously facing reduced natural resources, increased political instability, and widespread economic inequality. We've been talking about this from the get-go. And I want to know at what catastrophic point might the lack of access to written knowledge and communications technology push us over the edge. We've already been looking at this, which is great. And if that point is closer than we would like to believe, except it is here, right? Why are we, both the archives and the information community at large, working so hard to preserve digital information against such great odds? And Bruce and I have posed these questions. We don't necessarily have the answers, but I feel like Jan does, sort of, and Jody and Amy. So thank you so much for that. So some of this is going to kind of some of this is going to maybe revisit a little bit of what people have already mentioned. So let's look at the big question first. Are technology-heavy societies doomed to failure and collapse? I feel like we've kind of answered that one already as well. So I mean, maybe there isn't a really clear answer, but we know that advances in technology can increase the chance of existential risk in the following ways. Environmental collapse, we're here. Often via the misuse of technologies or natural resources, plundering for technology production. This is the next variation on collapses we've already seen, such as the classic period Maya civilization, which was a combination of drought and deforestation along with economic disparity and political instability. Then there's things like synthetic biology. You wouldn't believe how much we discussed it in this seminar. Jared Diamond pointed out in his 2005 book, Collapse, that all of our current problems are due to unintended negative consequences of existing technology. And it's easy to see how this stance could be applied to synthetic biology. Maybe not so much through those incredible bionic limbs now available that you see people with, which are really inspiring, but in the use maybe of, let's say, things like mass production of bacteria to eat up oil spills or fix cracked concrete, which is like the new thing that you've probably seen already online. They seem altruistic and maybe innocuous, but we just don't know enough about how they might evolve over time. And then there's massive critical infrastructure destroying cyber attacks. And more on this in a minute, but hello, WannaCry, right? Like how timely was this? I'll get back to that. And then in the seminar, we also talked a lot about malevolent artificial intelligence, which some people in these communities, in the academic communities and the research communities, are taking really seriously. But the opinion is divided on when and if this tipping point will be reached, and maybe we're not even going to get there. Everything will collapse before that. So some of this seems a little bit sci-fi, but it's being talked about and discussed and researched, and money is being put into all of this stuff at certain levels. This is what happens when you live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT is doing a lot of this stuff. So certainly technology is creating tools that can potentially cause exponential damage. And then the question is whether our collective defenses can protect us from this increasingly offensive capacity. That's a big open question. And computers are differently vulnerable. The internet is naturally empowering. We've already talked about this. It allows attacks to scale to a degree that is almost impossible before computers and networks. Kind of a no-brainer. Fewer attackers can do more damage to sophisticated technology. Computer systems fail in new ways, such as class breaks. And this is where every instance of a system becomes vulnerable. And we're not used to this, although we're going to get used to it pretty quickly, I think. So for instance, we know how pre-motherboard cars fail. Parts have mean times between failures. We can calculate failure rates and plan accordingly. But software is different. So hypothetically, all the driverless cars work perfectly, not really, but maybe, until a class break one day when none of them work. and you already see sometimes this is happening on sort of a smaller scale as large volumes of things that are in production are recalled because there's a class break and this sort of thing. So the trend is even more dangerous as the systems become more critical. So you're crashing all the cars, or you're shutting down all the power plants at the same time, and so on. The software monoculture combined with increasing network capacity makes this worse. Everyone is using the same system, so we share the same vulnerabilities. We're not concerned as much about the security of the average or the threat posed by the average attacker, maybe, but with the smartest hacker who can encapsulate their expertise in software, the 5 Sigma guy or team who can ruin it for everyone. And then I never even mind the hackers, which is a huge problem right now. But what about natural events that have an exponential negative impact on our information systems? So I'm thinking of things like the Carrington event of 1859, which you might know about. It's a mass coronal ejection from the sun that hit Earth and disrupted telegraph systems across North America and Europe. A similar geomagnetic storm knocked out power across Quebec in March 1989, and if I recall correctly, it was a pretty cold March, so that's a very serious thing. And a Carrington-class event narrowly missed Earth on July 23, 2012. Apparently it took a couple years for the folks who knew about it to let us know that it happened, so it could have been pretty critical. So we're not talking about remote chances anymore, or low probability even for very high-risk events. Maybe a large CME will be the catastrophic tipping point. I don't know. And if so, though, does our emergency planning really take medium or long-term power loss into account? Of course, I should say CMEs aren't a product or an outcome of the Anthropocene, but this epoch makes us more vulnerable to natural events like CMEs on top of everything else. And so as information moves into these sorts of network systems, they're increasingly vulnerable to these sorts of threats. And I'm going to say the R word, but we're talking about system resilience is one part of any defense. Maybe it's not enough, but that includes the resilience of our collective information resources. And so we've already started talking about this. What happens to existentially critical knowledge when it's no longer at our virtual fingertips? I'm just going to take my Bruce hat off for a second to talk about the fact that I'm a records manager. That's most of my time is. And I'm so tech dependent on communicating with the offices around the university, monitoring where their information is held, who holds it, how we move it around, how we're sharing it, how we're preserving it, that when we lost power just for an hour, I couldn't do any part of my job at all. Even inventorying paper records depends on word processing. At this point, I wasn't worried about losing information because there were backups, and we didn't think it was a big deal that we lost power. It was annoying. And in the archives, assuming we would be allowed to serve patrons during an outage, which actually we aren't, but let's say we were, in a pinch, we could use some paper shelf lists that we still have in our backlog to identify those records that are held in the same building, which is a minority of our holdings. They happen to be in the basement. We won't go there. I do go there all the time. We could bring boxes up and down stairs for research use. But that's it. That's all we can do without power if we were even allowed to do that. And it would be a real pain because we don't have much natural light in the reading room. We wouldn't be able to use the elevator, which actually is what we normally use to bring things upstairs. The stairs aren't, for whatever weird reason, even though it was purpose-built or somewhere else, down the hall. And patrons would run out of battery power, of course, to make notes and take photos on their laptops and phones. It's a ubiquitous way of doing research in the reading room now. But it's just about doable, and that's the situation for a really small set of non-critical information. If something like a cascading power grid failure occurs, and I need to set up a power generator, which, by the way, I don't know how to do, and that information doesn't come on paper or isn't written on the generator itself, and it's the middle of the night in the winter and I only have so much battery power, and the entire east coast of North America is in the same boat, how long will it be before I'm warm enough or have enough light to relax enough to even think about any other basic needs, never mind my work? So we city dwellers, as someone else has already pointed out, don't have much common sense. I mean, some of us do, like Jody does, but as we like to think we do. Most of my clients at work can't really conceive of not having power up and running after 48 hours. Like, not really. Like, they just assume it's going to happen. IT certainly can't. Or if they can, they assume that the cloud will be accessible somewhere where we can get to it, not so much later. in time. So this is how business continuity firms sell their services. Power will at some point return at least to one of their distributed sites. Imagine that the GPS navigation satellites are down and there's no long-range communication devices to tell drivers responsible for the just-in-time food supply where to deliver their goods. You know, what do the drivers do? Use shortwave radio? Do they even still have that in their cabs? I don't know. Could we rely on them to know where to go and to stay on the road? I don't think so, and no offense intended to the drivers, right? Most of the food chain resilience literature that I've dipped into touches on the effects of severe weather and climate change and strategies in the face of stockpiling and panic buying, but it doesn't go into any detail at all about how vital communications are to delivery logistics. Dawn Wright characterizes digital resilience as data and tools freely accessible, interchangeable, operational, of high quality and up to date. But this presupposes an available baseline infrastructure for output and delivery. The Anthropocene can't necessarily guarantee such an infrastructure, even when there is the political will, economic resources, and cooperative networks for that, for output and delivery. It certainly can't guarantee an infrastructure, whether analog or digital, and the baseline, and may actually nurture forces that disable it, very probably nurture those forces. So does the growing prevalence of digital information storage pose a serious threat to humanity? Well, digital information requires technology in order to be accessible, and again, I'm not the first person here to say that. This is more than just being able to read magnetic media or file formats from only a few decades ago, right? Digital information simply cannot be accessed without electric power, and remote digital information can't be accessed in a world without digital networks. So library and archives are under tremendous pressure right now to convert analog materials into digital formats in order to enhance delivery, to provide free access to all types of born digital information, some of it proprietary, so that its users have instant access without having to come to its source. And the ways that we prioritize what materials are digitized or provided often has more to do with juggling limited budgets, huge volumes of both analog and digital material, and a careful appraisal of demand than with what might be termed the vital information to survival. Let me digress here just a little bit to say that, as some of you probably know, vital records have long been a concept in records management. They're defined as those that are mission critical, necessary for the successful operation of the organization, whether ongoing or in an emergency. Vital records should be identified in business contingency or emergency plans so that they can be either relocated quickly if necessary or mirrored across multiple locations. Much was made of the records that were lost on 9/11, after which many organizations in the New York City area created or paid for third-party business recovery operations across the river in New Jersey or further afield. These operations, however, are for the vast majority of the small minority of the organizations that use them and can afford them, designed for relatively short periods of time and are cripplingly expensive, although apparently not as expensive as losing the business entirely. Many of the services rely on generator power, which in turn, of course, relies on fuel, which eventually relies on a working transport and supply chain management system. Some backup and recovery data centers have their own power substations as well, but electric power on the scale that data centers now need is not a closed loop. So we're back to the beginning. And libraries are increasingly asked, as you guys know, to spend their budgets on digital materials and to downsize their traditional holdings to save physical space, to enhance remote access, and in academic spheres to address a reluctance on the part of students to use those materials. It's great not to have to leave your house, of course, to access information, and if you're stuck somewhere due to a hurricane, a tornado, a flash flood, etc., then it's an advantage to be able to look up what to do and to get updates online, unless you don't have cell service or power. And then suddenly the prepper mentality starts to make a little bit more sense. That's why libraries traditionally preferred microfiche and film as preservation backups for so long, because remember, you can even read them with a magnifying glass, right? There's no power for the reader. But in this case, the information's still at the library, which I think is actually really important, and of course I support what our colleagues were just saying about libraries as hubs and gathering critical information. But how do we communicate it to those folks who need it, who can't, literally can't get to the library? I guess I could print out all of FEMA's information, from biological threats to wildfires and everything in between, including not very helpful material on how to survive after a nuclear blast, and hope that I have it to hand in an accessible, safe place. But that isn't solving the larger issue, of course. And the libraries and archives that are the most likely to have the information we need may be the least likely to have the resources to make them available. Vital records and information take on a whole new dimension when we leave organizational and even governmental structures behind. A farmer in a drought-stricken Dust Bowl still has a better chance of survival than I do as a half-drowned city dweller. I don't even have the equipment to catch the local fish, if there are any fish in the plastic, oil-saturated sludge that our oceans might end up as. So what role do, will, or can libraries play in providing the information we need for basic survival? We see daily that libraries are often the first places to be cut from budgets, that we've just been talking about, or are under physical threat during political and environmental crises. But sometimes we prevail, as just discussed, in situations where they become literal sanctuaries in times of upheaval. So in those situations, they've provided basic health and human services. We've already talked about this. In Baltimore, in 2015, the Pennsylvania Avenue branch of the public library famously stayed open to provide sanctuary, safe haven to the people in the community. The same thing happened in Ferguson, 2014. They both had power, I'll just note, which probably helped. After 2004's Hurricane Katrina, bookmobiles from municipal libraries in Indiana and Illinois were turned into cybermobiles that provided internet services to the Orleans parish. 4 libraries in the network were destroyed, but the distributed nature of the system meant that some access was still available to the resources held in those collections. Limited access was better than none. But in the case of a very large catastrophic event, let's say the big one on the West Coast and a Katrina-like hurricane on the East Coast simultaneously, how long would it take the Midwest to get to us? How would information be shared without infrastructure? How long would it take before bit rot and corruption set into the systems without power? How much of our digital resources would be lost? And how much is no longer created or kept in analog formats? Enough to allow us to rebuild, enough to keep us going for how long? Can we prevent an even more literal dark ages? Maybe we can't, I don't know. So why are we working so hard to preserve digital information against such great odds? Because we have an immediate and ongoing duty of care reflected in our mission and ethics, and it's sort of obvious to us. We're not just gonna walk away. We did worry and dither about digital information well past the point of no return. So that we now have digital as well as analog backlogs. But we did and we continue to tackle the problem. And in the process, we make some of our holdings accessible in ways not possible pre-internet. To a wider, broader audience that makes creative use of information kept over time, big data, and of deep data that's more meaningful and useful than the arguably shallower and smaller pool before it. But our efforts are still a drop in the bucket. We have centuries of material to digitize and an enormous wealth of born digital material to preserve over the long term. Its exponential growth makes the basic tasks of appraisal, processing, and short and medium and long-term access via metadata and a plethora of platforms difficult, if not impossible, under the best of circumstances. And in the worst of or worsening circumstances of the Anthropocene, which it may be inevitable, it's not clear how to save the digital information vital to basic survival, at least not for the first world, right, which is where it's kept. Never mind to document our history as a species. I was struck recently by the Doomsday Vault in Svalbard, Norway, also known as the World Arctic Archive. It's been getting a lot of press. It opened for business in early April and storing data on film. The vault is near the older Global Seed Vault, so that's handy, right? I can get my seeds and then the information on how to grow them. It's like right next door. However, despite the catchy press name, the vault doesn't necessarily hold vital records. Countries, companies, or individuals are encouraged to buy its services to preserve data that's particularly significant to their culture. This also assumes that a country has one unified culture, but I'm not going to go there. Digital data is stored onto photosensitive, multi-layered analog film, which is supposed to last between 500 to 1,000 years under the right conditions. And the company that does the conversion is quoted as saying that the process is similar to turning data into big QR codes on film. You know? So in other words, the data is still only machine readable, although it does sound like there's some kind of option to receive the equivalent of human readable microfilm. And that apparently all the metadata is made human readable. So it's the local equivalent of the gold record on Voyager, I think. It's a nice memorial, but it's not a particularly useful resource. And they actually advertise the fact that they're in permafrost, which is melting. I'm like, that's not a selling point to me. Sorry. So we're back to the same problem. How do we preserve that vital information? And so Bruce likes to think that, I'm not dissing Bruce, we're building resilience into our IT infrastructure. That's his job. He does computer security too. His resilience, he's defined it as a combination of survivability, adaptability, recoverability, and migration. And it's also an emergent property, that is a property often found in a complex system, but which individual members don't have, which I think is interesting when we think about that, and I'm out of time. Okay, so all this, I'll finish by saying that although large companies think that they're highly resilient in terms of information storage and processing, we're not sure if that's true, and I don't know if we can learn those lessons as libraries. We might like to look at that, but we're talking about very different resources. And it's not clear that our resilience can remain commensurate with the threats that we face in terms of digital storage. And so we need to start taking more seriously the incredible fragility of the infrastructure that our digital collections are based on. I'll leave it at that. Thanks. You can find your, let's see.
Yeah, I know, I'm going slideshow. All right, I'm tall, so I'm doing this. So I think this presentation is going to be really interesting in dialogue with some of the others that we've seen, especially today. Today I'll be talking about the large-scale digital library in response to the Anthropocene. So I used to keep a pack of these stickers in my car and put them on SUVs, kind of like, just to illustrate, I'm a lifelong environmentalist, so I bring that to this discussion. And I'm also a librarian. I've been invested in digital libraries for about 13 years, but this is me in the non-virtual world at Occupy Oakland Library. So I'm feeling a sense of concern and panic, like all of you, and really wondering how I can address this problem through my work. So it's really a relief to be a meeting like this where we're focused on kind of both of these sides of what I think about. And I just wanted to echo what Madeline said yesterday about we're all being brave to be grappling with this for a couple days. So thanks for being here on day 2 to talk about this. So in this presentation, I'm going to cover really quickly the large-scale digital library that I work on, which is Hotty Trust Digital Library, use cases that our digital library enables and how they might apply to the problems of the Anthropocene, how we're positioned right now in terms of being able to make it through the disruption that's coming or not, as we're hearing. And I would say after yesterday's discussion, I'm coming at this really from a virtue ethics standpoint, that I'm on Team Hope, but fully cognizant of what that means. So I think of Hotty Trust as a research library at web scale. We're a collaborative organization of currently 128 libraries, primarily North American research libraries. There's some partners worldwide. So Hotty Trust is libraries. We have a digital library with a mission of preservation and access for our aggregated collection, and within the Hotty Trust Research Center, tools for computational research. We also have a shared print program, which is developing a distributed print archive of volumes that match those in the digital library across our libraries. So Hotty Trust has been in existence for 9 years, a flash in the pan. And we originate really from the library side of the house rather than archives. So this is the published record, what's been selected by libraries over time and digitized from libraries. So of course we have a parallel with Google Books. Google Books is commercial and much bigger. Many of the Hotty Trust partner libraries are also Google library partners. We host books digitized in library partnerships with Google and also with the Internet Archive and volumes that are digitized out of the libraries by the libraries themselves. So we're bringing it all together, and bringing it together like this enables economy of scale, standardized services, but I think importantly also a collaborative locus for action. So we have over 15 million digital volumes, 5.3 billion pages, 680 terabytes, tons, we're counting. And I think about what it has taken to make this, hundreds of years, thousands of people it's taken to get here. Libraries bringing the books in, cataloging, keeping them on the shelves over time, migrating the catalog cards to digital metadata, the massive effort it's taken to digitize all the books and now host them and create and maintain services, let alone organizations, authors, editors, publishers, all who contributed to the books coming into existence. So I carry this acknowledgement of this huge human endeavor represented in this digital library with me in my work. And of course it's taken energy and carbon expended, have to acknowledge that. And another note is it's not finished by any means. We're still working on it. It's a work in progress. So I'll give you some really just sort of brief information to give you an idea of the scope of the collection. These are the contributing libraries, the top contributors, big public universities, Harvard, range of dates in our collection from 1500s through 2000s as represented in the metadata. All kinds of languages, half of it is in English. So, you know, really kind of representative of North American research libraries. And part of my role is to build our federal documents collection. So about 1 million of these are federal documents right now. And here's some subjects, you know, Library of Congress classification. So this digital conversion of books from print over the last 9 or 10 years has been transformative. There's the physical volumes are freed from format and can be found by anyone anywhere. You know, it's that kind of optimistic side here. And so here, of course, you know, we see this discovery of carbon's influence on the temperature of the Earth being reported here. Evidence. So the texts are also extracted and enable new uses such as search, indexing, and text mining, but they're also connected to the rest of the digital information. And you know, here's a Reddit discussion on the internet. We have persistent links to all the books, to the individual pages. You can embed books and snippets of code. There's publicly available metadata sets, so people can programmatically add links to library catalogs and discovery systems. And so it's I think there's a lot more to do here, but very connected. And so here's, you know, why are we trying to colonize Mars? And somebody says, this will blow your mind. Then here's famous author Robert Heinlein. And then we get Heinlein's own voice added to the discussion. And actually, this is funny. He says, indeed, a happy new year, beginning the 11th year in the age of space, greatest era of our race, the greatest despite gasoline shortages, pollution, overpopulation, inflation, wars, and threats of wars. These too shall pass, but the stars abide. But, you know, maybe not us. So with digitization now, the full text of millions of books is available not only for search engine indexing, but computational analysis of text mining. So in 2010, a group from Google, MIT, and Harvard put out a bit of a manifesto where it described this new frontier and some of the things that were now possible, called Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books. They tried to coin the term culturenomics, I think it was, but it didn't stick. But one piece of their research focused on frequency of occurrence of names of famous people over time in cohorts by birth and profession. Here's an example of the 1871 cohort. Do you recognize any of these people? So in this work, they delineated trajectory of fame curves for various types of famous people. Found that different types of professions had different trajectories of fame. And I heard them speak about this, and there was one experiment in this research that most struck me. They looked at creative people in Europe in the World War II period and charted their trajectories of fame. Then they zeroed in on curves that matched the standard trajectory curves but were cut off, and those people died. But from the matching curve, you could presume that they would have been famous. So of course, since then, digital humanities and text mining uses have blossomed. But this example sticks with me as we look to ways we might creatively use this corpus to understand our past, see forks in the road and possibilities for taking alternative paths. Maybe it's a stretch, but hopefully gives you ideas. And the Hotty Trust Research Center is a place where we're developing tools for researchers to do this work. So thinking more about the value of our digital collection and how it can be realized in ways that move us forward, here's some more examples on a practical level. I think this was the title of somebody's talk yesterday, What is Old is New Again? So as we need to focus on natural, mechanical, and local arts, there's a treasure trove of how-to in the print record. So here's a book on beekeeping from 1921. You can do this. And not to use one of those library bingo buzzwords, but it does fit in with the rise of maker culture and sort of people rediscovering these kind of arts. Here's another one, maybe ideas before their time, but now can be revisited. Here's a 9-mile bike path in Los Angeles in 1901. Here's a 1979 solar house competition book full of fun designs, including this one, a dog house. They couldn't resist including, and then I couldn't resist including. So also a number of times I've had university scientists contact me about digitizing collections from the 70s focused on solar energy. So some of the designs and ideas that didn't get momentum then, but now might be useful to revisit. So this is a NASA volume on economical solar heating systems for homes. You know, admittedly flawed, we're, in this capitalistic age, but there may be ideas here. And then I say, the 70s, here's everyone excitedly gathered around electric cars. And, this is a cautionary tale aspect, but I look upon these fondly. This is sort of a record of the struggle that we're always trying to find something new and find a way. And so, perhaps some of these things will give us ideas. I couldn't resist including this one. So getting back to a more macro view of the transformative nature of the large-scale digital library, here we have a view in the Hotty Trust of a research inquiry, just a quick search to turn up information on Standing Rock and water. Here we see the presence of U.S. government documents in Hotty Trust coming up in a search that wasn't necessarily looking for government documents. And also notice on the left the cataloging facets, Indians of North America, geology, public lands. So, what if we could free up these 3,500 plus items returned in the search from the Library of Congress classification system and instead apply Indigenous knowledge organization schemes? Digital library leader Bethany Novisky talks about this more eloquently than I in her 2014 Digital Humanities in the Anthropocene lecture and essay, which if you haven't read, I wholeheartedly recommend. Paraphrasing her, she suggests we can gain from new and different concepts of time, relative importance, viewpoint, community-centered, and culturally appropriate systems to organize resources. So new types of description and arrangements for a large-scale digital library can not only give us additional ways to understand and access information and content, but also a better handle on ways to bring that organization into the real world. And again, perhaps that's a pretty far out idea, but I just think we can get them from this aggregated corpus. So with geographic indications present in our catalog records and texts, in the aggregate we can provide fodder for a deeper sense of place and support local efforts like what Amy's talking about. Here we have a book showing the record of trout that used to be in Berkeley, and my sons thought this was fascinating as there's no trout fishing in Berkeley going on right now. Here's another example. There's data in all of these publications. How do we get it out? I talked with a few people yesterday about this. It's very hard. We're still working on figuring out how to do this at any scale. So here's a picture of Hotty Trust staff in a data center in 2009. And it was taken with my 2009 cell phone camera. So you can kind of tell. But so we have 2 mirror sites in the Midwest. Really, this is kind of what it comes down to at the University of Michigan and Indiana University. And there's a tape backup. We're a trusted digital repository. We've been certified as such. We've gone through digital preservation audits. We're using standards for digital objects and metadata and systems. But is there really an opportunity here for us to adhere to different kinds of standards? Is there an opportunity to use the scale for these kind of migration opportunities, even if it is just putting this record on the gold record and shooting it out into space? That's kind of the more pessimistic view of it. We could rescue it or shoot it forward somehow. So our shared print archive is also being built. We could use our scale to do intentional collection development on scale. So an example of this is in federal documents. There's a momentum to focus on the EPA or NOAA, these kinds of things that dovetail with the data refuge efforts and other work that's going on. So Saul Griffith is the founder and CEO of Other Lab in San Francisco, and he's the kind of guy that does TED Talks and those kind of things, but he's someone who thinks about infrastructure a lot. He says, the scale of climate change requires thinking and acting in multi-decade terms at the level of infrastructure. We deal best with greenhouse gases by arranging our infrastructure so we don't have to think about climate and energy issues every minute. So can our scale and collaboration enable us to take these big actions? This is Google's data center in Finland, and it's cooled by icy waters of the nearby bay. And Google is carbon neutral. A commercial company like Google has a lot of dollars to invest in this. Can libraries find a way? So just some food for thought. And I'd like to close with another point made by Saul Griffith. I was struck by his optimism in the talk I saw him give. And his point was, since we have to totally reinvent, we might as well aim for beautiful and fun if possible. This picture is from Burning Man, an event where many artists incorporate various kinds of energy solutions into these craft they're building and living out in the desert for a week. So perhaps this is a frivolous and simplistic and privileged viewpoint, but I do think that in the face of this magnitude of change that's coming, it's really the human angle that will enable us to generate enthusiasm and connection and enable us to grapple with the Anthropocene. So thanks very much. Oh, and this is for Mother's Day. these guys are teenagers now. The guy with the question authority shirt, he's an anarchist. My son, he founded the Peace and Anarchy Club at Berkeley High School. So there you go.
I feel like it's a pretty big task to follow Hotty Trust. I know that in my role as a reference librarian, Hotty Trust is a pretty big deal, has saved my reference behind multiple times. So I thank you for all your work. Where had it? There we go. Okay. I'm Sara Lambton, and here, actually, I was going to set a timer because I know how fast these things go. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Okay. Can you all hear me now? Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, thank you all so much for being here. It's so inspiring, and I've learned so much. It's great that we're all together. It gives me hope. So, I'm not an archivist, but I am a librarian. I work at CUNY School of Law, so I'm a lawyer and I'm a librarian, and I also teach legal skills. So I teach legal research and lawyering skills to young young lawyers as a librarian. And I just wrote a book called Environmental Information, and there will be a slide about that at the end. I'm not here just to tell you about my book, although I'm really excited, but it's kind of a reference resource. So I feel like I'm here to give you a really practical overview that if you are curious about or want to know more about, you can learn about from my book or from emailing me or having a conversation with me. So I work in the scholarship world of environmental information, which until this year was just a really peaceful kind of, I had my own little slice of the pie. I'm a lawyer who talks about environmental information access. It was amazing. My dream goal was to one day help the EPA maybe revamp its environmental databases and make them more user-friendly. Like, that was my lofty goal. And then the election happened and everything changed. And I actually was here in this very building in February for the big New York City data rescue event. I helped plan that event. I became a part of the group that helped plan that event. So those data rescue events are planned by the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. I'm now their director of legal research, so I'm very involved in all of that activity too. So now, instead of just having the hat of librarian and then the other hat of law professor, I'm also doing all this other work that I know there's a lot of interest in here, so I would love to talk to you all about that too. Usually I just have this discussion that I'm about to have with you with lawyers, but really you are my dream audience. Librarians and archivists are my dream audience, because one of my main concerns is how can we as a group work to guarantee access to environmental information. Environmental information is unique. It's vital to environmental decision making and the environmental things that impact all of our lives. And not a lot has been done right now to make sure that that information is going to be maintained and going to be available to us when we need it, as evidenced by the need for all these data rescue events and for the need for data refuge to pop out of UPenn and start thinking about how we're going to archive it. There's obviously been a lot of failures in the way we think about environmental information and the way we kind of assume that it would always be ubiquitous and readily available. It is not, and it's up to us as librarians and archivists to think about how to solve these problems. So with that, I'm going to give you kind of a practical overview. I always tend to gravitate too far towards the practical. So if you want to have more theoretical discussions, I'm happy to do that too, but this is going to be a practical primer on environmental information and how we can find it and what is wrong with the way we are currently storing and providing access to it. So with that, I want to start with, what is environmental information? So in the United States, we don't have any laws or regulations that define what environmental information is. And to me, that's a huge problem. I have long been advocating for some sort of regulatory or statutory move to create a definition for environmental information. I actually just wrote a whole paper about it that is going to be coming out at the end of the month about why that's important. Luckily, other countries have created definitions for environmental information. So in 1992, there was this great international convention that resulted in this treaty. It was called the Rio Convention of 1992. And one of the things that they did in that convention was recognize access to environmental information as something that is really important for environmental sustainability. So environmental sustainability hinges on the public's ability to be able to look at environmental information. And that treaty led to a bunch of regional treaties. So the EU enacted its own treaty that took the Rio Convention one step further. And now everybody in the EU has to effectively do things to make sure that there is environmental information access in all of those nations. And then, in reaction to the EU treaty, which is called the Aarhus Convention, the UK and Scotland and Ireland and that region of the EU all created their own environmental information regulations, which are separate from the Freedom of Information Act and separate from all of their already existing transparency laws. So in those countries, there are special laws that govern environmental information access, which is amazing from the perspective of information access and probably makes it a lot easier to argue for funding for environmental information archiving and access, and has even led to the creation of some major environmental data portals that I will show you momentarily. So here are some of the major things that the EU has decided should be included in the definition for environmental information. So the state of the elements, the state of our water and land and air, that's all included in environmental information about those things. Information about pollution, right? About discharges and emissions and noise and radiation and waste. All of that data is also a part of the formal definition for environmental information, which means it has to be made publicly accessible. And then on top of that, measures and activities affecting the environment. So both environmental laws and regulation, but also major undertakings that might create pollution, right? Like major dredging projects and bridge building and dam building projects. All of that data also falls under the definition. And reports on the implementation of environmental legislation. So government reports about how environmental programs are going and how environmental regulations are actually affecting the environment. Cost, benefit, and economic analyses. So how did they decide to make these regulations and laws in the first place? And how did they decide that it was okay to go ahead and dredge this river? You know, how did they come to those decisions? That information is also included. And information about the effects of environmental conditions on human life. So flooding, and earthquakes and volcanoes and impacts of radioactive waste leaks and things like that. So as you can imagine, this is a ton of information, right? This definition is really broad and has a huge scope. And this information comes in all sorts of different forms. Some of it is permit documentation that polluters have to turn in. Some of it is databases filled with, numeric information that's supplied by regulatory scientists. So this information is huge, and it's also not stored centrally anywhere. There's no major hub that stores all of this information. It's in, the hands of private entities. It's in the hands of public institutes that maintain our grid and do things like that. It belongs to various agencies. Some of it might be in Department of Transportation. Some of it might be in, an environmental protection agency. So it's really decentralized. And this is a really big headache for people researching and looking for environmental information, which is actually, that's why I wrote my book, because as somebody who specializes in environmental law and teaches teaches legal research, I was really frustrated by how hard it was to find discrete pieces of environmental information. So not only is the information that's collected really decentralized, it also has a multitude of sources. Where do we go when we're looking for environmental information? Who creates this environmental information? That's also a very complicated question. So there are scientists that work for academic institutes. There are scientists that work for government agencies, both state and federal. I know somebody who works for the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and his job is to go out and test waterways for various chemicals, right? So he's creating environmental information in his daily work. States and federal governments often create packets, usually because of some statutory or regulatory mandate, right? Usually because the government is making them. They collect groups of environmental information together once or twice a year, and they write some sort of summary about what all that information means. So that's another form of environmental information. Also, regulated entities, which is a nice legal term that we use to mean polluters. Polluters have to give certain bits of information to the government under various environmental laws. So like the Clean Air Act makes everybody who's going to be putting a certain amount of toxic pollution into our airways fill out a bunch of permits. And then it makes them hand in regular reports as well. So, once or twice a year or even more regularly than that, they have to report certain types of activity. And if there's some sort of emergency, if too much of a certain toxin is accidentally emitted into the air, they also have to file some sort of public report in response to those types of things. So there are many, many, many sources of environmental information. And now I want to talk about why do I care as a lawyer, as somebody who works in government materials and a lot of government type of legal research. Why does it matter? Where's the link between environmental information and what I do as a legal researcher and a government information specialist? So, although the information has a lot of different types of sources, in the end, so much environmental information ends up in the federal government. And I put this up here kind of as a review civics lessons because I know most people aren't thinking about this as often as I am. But where in this tree do you think that most of our environmental information is? Does anybody have a guess? Yes, the executive, right? So each of these branches creates a different type of information. Courts create, let me start with the legislature. The legislature passes laws, right? So they create legislative documents, and we know what a lot of those are. Congress.gov and FedSys are great sources for these legislative documents. And then the courts interpret what the legislature meant when it was passing all these laws. What was the legislative intent? What should the scope of this statute or law really be? So the courts make judicial opinions, right? And you can get those also on various government websites like the SCOTUS website and also through PACER. You can look at court dockets and things like that. But the executive branch is where all the executive agencies do their work. So, you have the president, you have the vice president, but then you have the EPA, you have the Secretary of State, you have the Department of Transportation, you have NOAA, you have NASA. So you have a whole host of agencies. And one thing I wanted to point out, this is really nerdy and it gets into administrative procedures and all sorts of federal laws. But I wanted to remind everyone while we're having this conversation what the limitations of agencies are, what exactly agencies do. So agencies, federal agencies like the EPA, carry out the broad legislative mandates of Congress. Congress or the president in some situations when a president makes an executive order. That's why there have been so many executive orders lately. The president can tell federal agencies to do certain things through executive order. That's what an executive order is doing. Executive orders can't tell us what to do, but they can say, hey, DOJ, we want you to enforce this regulation this way. We want you to stop doing this and start doing this. Executive orders tell agencies what to do. But really, most administrative authority comes from Congress. When the Congress passes, let's say, the Clean Water Act, most Congress people aren't experts on what it means to have clean water, right? They just know that the Cuyahoga River caught on fire and their constituents seem worried, and they think something like, well, clean water, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, right? So they pass this broad statute. And what they say in the statute is, EPA, you figure out the details. You're in charge of implementing this, okay? We're going to give you the power to make regulations and create a program to protect our waterways. And then it's the agencies that actually do all the work of figuring out what pollutants shouldn't be allowed, what the permissible, particulate matter can be in the waterways, how to enforce these regulations. That comes down to the EPA, and they do this not just for the EPA, but I'm going to use the EPA as an example a lot because environmental information, there's a lot of it in the EPA. So that is why there is so much environmental information in agencies. And that's why things like data rescue happened, right? Is because all of a sudden there's this new administration, and our ability to access the huge amounts of information collected under these environmental programs, and all the work done by the thousands and thousands of people working in the EPA and all of these other environmental, adjacent federal agencies is suddenly at risk, right? So here are all the types of things that agencies do. They fill in the broad decrees of Congress. They provide all sorts of expertise. They hire scientists, tons of scientists. They hire all sorts of other policy experts in particular areas of environmental policy. They're able to react quickly. As you know, the legislature, it doesn't really act that quickly. And a lot of times things don't quite get through. But agencies are much more nimble, and they can react quickly. Like, let's say the Cuyahoga River is catching on fire. The EPA, because it's been enabled to, can go out and figure out how to clean that up really quickly and remediate the damage that's done. So those are just some of the things that federal agencies do every single day. And why is the information that these federal agencies have so important? It's because so much of our environmental information is housed in government databases, but it's also because the government uses information, the information that it gathers, to make the decisions that affect all of our lives. This is where they decide how to regulate air and water, what to do with our national monuments. Everything else happens in the government, and they make those decisions ostensibly based on the data and information that they've received, right? So our access to that information is really important in order to be informed citizens and to understand what is going on in our environment. And this takes me to, what is a librarian's role? And you can see I put up a lot of amazing activist librarians. So I will confess, I kind of am an activist librarian. I wrote an article a couple years ago in Library Quarterly about like how all of us have to get together and start being more vocal and more active in the interest of information access and in the interest of intellectual freedom and all the things that we supposedly, and I know we all do in this room, we all stand for. And I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, but I would argue that it is our duty and our goal and our role to become involved and to be advocates for environmental information access. So I wanted to give you all some tools. I have 5 minutes or so to do so, so I'm going to be quick about it. But I wanted to give you all some tools, some legal tools that you might not be aware of for doing that advocacy work that I think we're supposed to be doing. So I broke them into 3 categories. I wanted to tell you about some transparency laws that are really important and useful for getting environmental information, some environmental laws for environmental information access, and also I wanted to mention, just give a shout out to all of the work that's going on with EDGI and Data Refuge. But I would argue, and I think Data Refuge would also argue, and I know EDGI would probably argue, that it's unfortunate that we have to go to, that we have to do this post hoc work of grabbing all these data sites, and that in the future, hopefully, we'd all have a way, because we're the archivists, we're the librarians, we will have a way to be proactive so that we never have to turn to that, so that when we get an administration or a big change that is not favorable for environmental information access, we can say, we've already taken care of that. We're in charge. We're the archivists. We're the librarians. We got it. That's where I want to be, right? And I think that's where we all should, hopefully feel like maybe we're going, especially meeting here. I think it's a big step towards that. So here's what we have right now. We have the Freedom of Information Act. It is the major Freedom of Information law. I'm not going to dwell on it. You can read about it in my book. It's great. Now, you can also just Google it and learn about it that way. I'm not going to make you buy my book to know everything there is to know about FOIA. But there are also a host of environmental laws. So sometimes environmental information is actually made available through environmental laws. Environmental laws do all of the things up here. And the reason I put that picture up there is because although the environmental laws have this ideal of creating information access, oftentimes the access is really kind of flawed. Just look at EnviroFacts, which is supposed to be the big hub for environmental information access from environmental laws. it's horrible. I don't think it's been like updated since the 90s, and you can tell right when you go to the website that it is in bad shape. So I mean, that was my dream. My dream before this administration was just to fix that, you know, lofty goals. So maybe as a group, we can advocate that the government work on fixing and updating those types of websites. So these current programs are problematic. I only have 1 minute, so I'm just going to kind of scoot on through this. FOIA is broken. This was a report last year. So here's what I think we should be looking at as environmental information advocates. These are some of the major problems right now with environmental information access. Information is contained in a labyrinth. There are all these disparate websites and web databases have given EDGI and Data Refuge a huge amount of work because nothing is centrally located. We need central hubs for government environmental information. Information is hard to understand, so we need experts to help us break down that environmental information. FOIA exemptions block information access, so we need to be advocates for open information access. There are long delays for information access. We need to talk about the importance of quick information access, especially in the environmental information context. And environmental information providers use outdated technology. Envirofax is a great example. So we need to work on all of these things. This is my major platform for the next 5 years, and I hope you all want to join me in some capacity. And this is my book, and it's coming out at the end of this month. Environmental Law Institute is the publisher, and we can add it to the bibliography, hopefully. So thank you all.
Let me just switch over real fast. I'm loving the trajectory of the day. Excellent. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I know we're probably all ready for lunch, so I'll try to zip through and keep close note of my time. So thanks for the organizers, but I'll skip pleasantries. My research generally kind of focuses on knowledge organization and classification and how these domains intersect with biodiversity research in particular. So that's kind of the direction that I'm going to be taking here. And in particular, how nomenclature and control, right? This concept of control takes place in these spaces. And I'm only going to gloss over this. This is kind of a really quick summation of my dissertation that I just completed. So what I'd like to do today is to begin to think about how we can more clearly articulate an emphasis on biodiversity and climate issues from within the discipline, right? And in particular, right now I'm thinking a lot about pedagogy. This was initially supposed to include a discussion on ethics, but because of John's conversation, I kind of tweaked it a little bit last night. So I'm gonna go toward more into the practical domain of pedagogy a little bit. We've seen how archives can be spaces for kind of intervention, as well as data rescue, which has been brought up. So I want to kind of think about how to build on top of this within another domain of information studies. I'll be at Indiana University, Bloomington in August. I got a post there, and so pedagogy is definitely on my mind as I'm thinking about how to integrate all of the things we're talking about into the core curriculum, which is really important to me. And so I believe by extending some of our traditional literatures and professional information obligations, our programs have the potential to play an integral part in the activities occurring in all of these scientific domains. But also to expand our own core literatures, right? To embrace those outside of our discipline so that our core mission as library and information institutions are more tightly aligned with these long views. Rather than keeping the discourses separately, we need to tightly integrate them, I think. So that's a lot. But I'm gonna see this as kind of just a start to a conversation that we can hopefully continue even after this ends. So I kind of want to jump into the particular case. So I look at the catalog of life, and I'll talk about this. As we all know, one of the most drastic effects of the Anthropocene has been the massive fluctuation in biodiversity. The vast majority of research indicating a drop in biodiversity. Now, I'm being a little bit reductive here because there's obviously kind of arguments to the counter. There was an article published, I think it was in Nature, it could have been Science, last April, basically projecting there's twice as many bacterial species than we imagine. So there's a lot of different ways to look at biodiversity, but I'm taking kind of the accepted route here. And so knowing what species exists really matters, and this is what these databases come down to. And so biodiversity knowledge becomes the task of documentation, very, very basically. The enumeration and translation of real-world objects into certain manufactured and artifactual taxonomic structures. And so the documentation of species allows us to do a host of things. It makes decisions that proliferate into a number of social, cultural, political, and scientific domains. I can't wait for your book, Sarah, wherever you're at. I'm really excited about that. And so organizations such as the Catalog of Life, the entity I've been, incidentally, this is an article that was just published yesterday, actually, talking about the biomass of insects dropping by 80% over a period of almost only 25 years. So global organizations such as the Catalog of Life have arisen to gain as accurate a sense as possible, also problematic, and I'm kind of glossing over this, of the extent species currently living on the globe. It's currently the most comprehensive documentation, again problematic, but we can talk about that later. So there are a number of impediments arise in this space due to the process of collocation, namely the control of nomenclature to assure an up-to-date accepted species concept. So I'm looking at the zoologist in the room. We can have a really interesting conversation later. As well as as they also create a management hierarchy, a schema produced by consensus to communicate data as best as possible given the numerous theoretical and methodological divergences of taxonomic opinion. So it serves those two major purposes, right? The provision of a checklist, very simply, not so simply, as well as the development of an authoritative taxonomic schema. So first to the names. So the checklist provides a list of accepted species names along with synonyms and common names with references. It produces an annual checklist, annually, of species that is published to solidify taxon groups and to allow for a comparative study and the development of species kind of documentation over time. Such names are then used by infrastructures to collocate species information. Some names, that is to say validated text strings, function as data aggregating IDs. We can have a conversation about global unique identifiers and things of that nature, GUIDs, but really when it comes down to it, due to a lot of problematics, the name is really all they can hinge all of their data on. So the issues biodiversity specialists and informaticians see in this nomenclatural space are really familiar to all of us, right? Authoritative index control, thesaurus construction, disambiguation are part and parcel of the work we do. And the data retrieval systems in the spaces that we build in spaces as varied as the Library of Congress, to Google and other retrieval-oriented systems that obfuscate, right, classification behind layers of processes. These species lists and catalogs, they're important. They really are the only mechanism by which we can understand species diversity in any geographic and more complicatedly temporal locations. And so how these lists change over time can give us a sense of how climate change and other features of the environment are increasing biodiversity rates of loss in a multitude of locations. These lists are very much commingled with the intent of documenting species before they go extinct, right? So they're trying to beat extinction at its game. So the preservation of biodiversity knowledge, and I think this point is key here, and I'm still trying to really unpack it, what I really mean by this, is not only to preserve the information, data, and documents we produce, right, in the course of daily activities or scientific activity. We make data, records, we publish books, and we organize web pages, but also those naturally occurring objects that we are collectively, by our global activities, driving to erasure, a kind of anticipated, manufactured, and actively produced negative space in the ontology of our natural environment. So it's, in part at least, documentation driven by extinction. We document because we know we're going to destroy it. You get similar and parallel discussions in the archives world, and I'm thinking of Michelle Caswell's work and at UCLA on various cultures and communities and how documentation and record making is a way of maintaining social identity and position. So the second part of the Catalog of Life is a taxonomic hierarchy that is implemented in a number of online infrastructures to structure biodiversity data that has been curated by various data providers. As access structures, once again, we know how to assess these issues in terms of effectiveness, usefulness, and justness, which I think is something really important to talk about. And so in manufacturing a taxonomy, incidentally, so this is just a diagram that kind of shows the various kinds of databases that are brought into the catalog of life. And you can imagine all kind of the classificatory and ontological problems that get kind of brought into this process as it's all aggregated. Super interesting, but I'm not really going to talk about it. So its current annual version has about 156 individual databases. It's probably more by now. It's rising constantly. And many of these databases, they're very, very local, curated by one institution, one team, or one person. And so the drive to collectively document these databases into one system is a drive to get a complete picture of everything we know about biodiversity so that we can reflect on this knowledge within a non-governmental, within non-governmental and governmental policies. And because of the locality of these biodiversity databases, it's so often the case that they're abandoned, they're orphaned, and sometimes it comes down to just where are we going to put these databases so that people can eventually work on them, right? These are really basic issues. And so it's important to note that the catalog plays a major role in the ecology of online biodiversity infrastructures. As a taxonomic backbone, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, so the IUCN Red List, which identifies species at high risk for global extinction, uses the catalog as a starting point to kind of organize their own information. You can imagine kind of the ramifications of this backbone. So the catalog radiates outward fairly deeply into the information and policy network. So now I'm going to get a little bit more theoretical here, kind of grounding the practical a little bit. Why the catalog of life is the case here, right? Why does this even matter? For one, when we think about how we contextualize and advocate for environmental issues as being core to the subjects we teach in information and library programs, this is one way to do it, right? At least within knowledge organizations specifically. So I'm planning, so from the briefest snapshot that I've given of the catalog of life, one can see a number of ways in which information studies is not only prepared, but expertly situated to assist in the classification and structural management of biodiversity taxonomies. And this is quite separate, right, from the expertise of taxonomists that gets brought into these systems. These are two very different things. We as a discipline have the luxury of being what information scholar Marcia Bates calls orthogonal in nature, right? We touch upon practices in any number of domains. We're facile. And because of we have that unique opportunity to engage in these issues centrally into the way we conceptualize information problems that we then pose to students, right? Because these are problems that we can't solve, or we can ask them to ask questions that we haven't yet thought to ask. But even more fundamentally, I think it's important to think about what we mean when we're interested in the circulation of information, at least potentially, as one of our fundamental concerns in library and information studies. And secondly, what we mean when we say we're concerned with the information environment, very clearly articulated in the ALA Code of Ethics, in which this undifferentiated kind of potential information circulates in systems, between individuals, through algorithms, etc. And this is just basically from Melanie. I threw this up because of Yosemite. I'm sorry, Heather. So I looked to Marcia Bates to think about this issue as well. Marcia differentiates between two kinds of information. Information one, which includes undifferentiated potential information not yet sensed, perceived, or organized by humans, nor, of course, integrated into our knowledge organization schemes that contextualize this data or information into social communities and structures. Kind of the undocumented world of the Anthropocene, an undivided and fluid system of objects, networks, connections, and artifacts. As Bates states, information is the pattern of organization of matter of rocks, of the earth, of plants, of animals, bodies, or brain matter. Information exists independently of living beings in the structure, in structure, and would do so whether or not any living being were present to experience information. Bates's information two is the world of meaning, the systems that coordinate our discourse, communication, scientific institutions, and render information one manipulatable within formulations of technological structures. Information two, then, is that information that has been perceived by the nature of that perception, is enmeshed into a network of what Luciano Floridi calls well-formed and ultimately semantically meaningful information. And so no surprise to anybody in this room, this is somewhat of an obvious statement, but there is an unavoidable artificial distance, or what Floridi calls an in-betweenness, between the documentation we organize and the natural world we're trying to encapsulate. This distance has direct impacts on how we perceive the natural world, and perhaps more importantly, how that natural world is also controlled and changed as a result of these knowledge systems. Information control, then, is environmental control in a very real sense. As Paul Edwards states in A Vast Machine, everything we know about the world's climate, the book is about climate change and climatology and climate modeling, past, present, and future, we know through models. The in-betweenness of database technologies, their architectures and classificatory commitments control the positions of natural objects within a discourse of environmentalism and conservationism. So to wrap up, I'm deeply devoted to articulating and pursuing ways in which the environment is integrally tied to the discourse of our library and high schools, much in the way notions of social justice have been integral to the way in which I conceptualize the future of this discipline, to make it a just society. A society, however, can only thrive and be just if it exists. When there is a when there is a healthy synergy created between communities and the environments in which they function. There is no social justice without taking into account environmental conditions. Extending these notions then, an eco-social justice is one that takes into account all of these valences and sees systems such as the catalog and other representational structures, and we can extend this to all kinds of different subdomains, as playing an integral part in the success or demise of species based on their classed position within these systems. If you're not on the IUCN Red List, you're not going to get saved. And the last time I checked, we're not on the IUCN Red List. And this is fundamentally, I believe, at least in large part, an information problem with which we can engage and partner with the scientific community to think through and potentially solve. And so I'll end there. And so I really am looking forward to conversations. I think this is one of the most exciting spaces I've been in for a while. And so let me know if you're interested in thinking about how to work this into pedagogy from a lot of different directions and in a lot of different kind of conditions and states, because I think that if we don't change our core iSchool curriculum or library curriculum, it's going to be difficult, I think, to bridge those two kind of professional and practical areas of discourse. Thank you. So I think I actually saved us some time.
So we have a little bit of time for questions. Panelists can come to the front. Questions? Everyone seems ready for lunch. Okay, we have here.
So I'm kind of glad that we ended on a note about what is or is not going to get saved, because I've been thinking, we talked yesterday a little bit about appraisal and that sort of thing, and a map from this morning about where in Manhattan is not going to exist, right, is kind of striking. And so and the word vital, I think, was a really interesting word. Sorry, I'm going to ramble a little bit. So I guess my question is, like, why, if you have to pick high ground for a large-scale repository of digital or analog or whatever it is, why would it be for that and not for, like, people or food? Or butterflies, I don't know.
Well, I mean,
I didn't mean to pose a question.
no, that's okay. I mean, I don't have a really articulate answer for you. I mean, we all obviously have to prioritize our responsibilities and our initiatives, and the fact that I've focused on biodiversity and kind of zoological and biological specimens, is just because that's what I chose to talk on, right? I mean, I could have had another talk about how it is that we can relate that to kind of the real kind of social and cultural conditions that we're experiencing. So, I mean, I could just say very unarticulatedly, you know, I agree with you.
One comment I would have is that there's other models for hosting data. For example, someone has positive, and you probably know much more about this than I, people hosting servers in their homes to warm their homes and distributing data that way. So I'm just thinking a little bit beyond that. It may not be that it's a giant data center somewhere. It might be the Internet Archive is put out on BitTorrent, for example. So there might be other ways to do this. And do both.
This is a little bit tangential to what you just asked, but I guess one of my points was that we need information to even know where to put the folks, the people. And if we're segregated from that information because of the infrastructure's fragility, then we don't even know how to make those choices, although we try, you know, as hard as we can to do that in advance, but that's problematic.
In 1990, there was a group in Washington, D.C. called the Committee for the National Institute for the Environment that morphed into the National Council for Science and the Environment, which exists today. NCBI had, NCIE had a four-pronged approach to doing some things, and two of the different sections was going to be one on environmental data and another one on environmental information. And Bruce Gritton from the Monterey Bay Research Aquarium and myself wrote the proposal for creating the National Library for the Environment that was presented at a number of different locations. Actually, I think that there's an ALA resolution that approved the process for doing this, somewhere around 91, 92 or thereabouts. And this sort of like coincided with the creation of the EPA's Office of Environmental Information, which everybody thought was going to be the be-all and end-all, that we would see the fruition of this proposal for an expanded EPA library. And then we come up to 2005 when the EPA library decides it's going to close itself. And again, ALA and AALL joined forces to trying to stop that from taking place. ALA created an ad hoc committee to deal with it. And when we gave our initial report after the first year, we went and thought we were going to get an extension of our mandate, and we were told, thanks for everything you did, cease and desist. One of the proposals that was in that report was the creation of, actually would call it, like, we were going to model it after NEPA and have an environmental quality kind of a thing, an environmental impact statement. I guess we would say it would be an analog, and having an information impact statement, that if you're going to close down a program, you got to come up with a mandate that we were going to hopefully get legislative approval for, and have that kind of a parallel system where if you're going to close something down, you got to have public comment on what's going to be the cause and effect and the impact and the ramifications of closing down a federally funded or sponsored data or information program. And it sort of came to a complete halt. And I think Bernadette Abbott-Hudusky and myself were probably the only two people who've ever continued the dialogue, usually over drinks at an ALA annual meeting when we run into one another.
Any other questions?
Yeah, well, give it to Madeline first. Oh, no, you go. I don't know.
So one of the questions that came up at a different meeting I was at the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment, and it turned out that a lot of those literature type professors were trying to get their students to write public comments and engage with the public process. And so I wondered if you guys could comment on that, about trying to make people who are not lawyers and not government information specialists engage with these sort of complicated and hard to read processes.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually like one of the major goals of my life. And I wish I wouldn't have only been I wish I would have been already a member of ALA back when you were having those conversations, Fred. That's definitely where my concern lies now too. So sad that like 20 years later, that's where we are. But yeah, so we actually require our law students to, in our public institutions class, which is administrative law, we require them to write a comment to a proposed regulation. So proposed regulations are posted in the Federal Register, and if you go to regulations.gov, everybody can comment on them. And there's no limit. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be an expert. Anybody, because these comment periods are designed to give all of us as citizens and stakeholders in the regulatory outcomes a chance to voice our concern, to voice our support. So I would urge everybody to do that. And I think one of the greatest tools we have, generally for comment making, but especially environmental comment making on regulation, it's called The Art of Commenting, and it's also published by the Environmental Law Institute. It's a tiny little book, but it's amazing. Highly recommend it. Beth Mullins is the author.
Art of commenting?
Yes. And the only reason I know this is because I've used it so many times, both Mullins. I should be like her marketer. I think it's great. But yeah, I think anybody getting a hold of that will make you realize how easy it is to do. It gives you the steps to do it. It's a really practical book. So that's my like holy grail of writing public comments. Yeah.
I had a request. I can't believe I'm sitting in the room with all this information, and I was just asked to be on a phone call this Tuesday with 3 people from the EPA and 1 from NASA to explain what are libraries doing around sustainability. So, like, without going into too many details, I would love people to just email me, just shower me with what sorts of things you would like me to also talk with them about. And frankly, I've barely wrapped my head around it. They just emailed me, and everything's going on fast forward, and I'll be preparing for this call. But please, just tap me on the shoulder or find me on the event page and just email me, because this is like this room is filled with people. I wish you could all be on the call with me.
So I'm going to try to sum this up, what I'm hearing, because it's Mother's Day, and I want to celebrate I think what mothers do is protect vulnerability, and I think you folks on the resilience panel were talking about sort of the people need the space to be vulnerable and to fail, and I think the panelists too talked about the vulnerability of organizations on that level, and I think we as individuals in the room are able to admit that we're vulnerable and life is precarious, and we're trying to get our institutions to do that. Do you know what I'm saying? Sort of reach that higher ground. That if we can get the institutions to that level, and then get the politicians to that level, because I think the elephant in the room, Trump, he's not able to admit vulnerability. So anything you'd like to say on that?
I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about all of us flying here, and I do carbon offsets for my flights, and I haven't submitted that for reimbursement, for example. So I should start doing that. That's like a little thing we can start doing. And then, I'm talking about, we need to think about standards, and I've been talking to different people in academic libraries about measuring our carbon footprint, and there isn't really like a carbon footprint calculator for libraries. Maybe there is, but I haven't found it. If you know of one, let me know, because I've talked to people in library leadership who are actually really interested in this. So I think there's some things we can do, big and small.
And I think also the efforts like the data refuge and data rescue and all of the data efforts, I think that also shows kind of, we recognize the vulnerability. We gave the space for it. It's not like it's so well organized, and it is the most grassroots thing I've ever observed. We just came out of nowhere and we all came together. So I do think that recognizing vulnerability also has given us strength. Because one of my main hopes is that all of these efforts, past when all the information has been archived and collected and hopefully made publicly accessible somewhere, past that, we now have a new network that didn't exist before of a bunch of different librarians and information specialists from different areas we wouldn't have met otherwise. And I think that also creates a new type of power.
So I sort of wish my proposal for this colloquium had been on book history in the Anthropocene. I wish I want to go back in time and change it, but yeah, it's only a lightning talk, so maybe I could do it. But and I said this on Twitter, so I'm sort of repeating myself, but I think if we're talking about the vulnerability of our materials and talking about maker culture and traditional arts, I think we need to think about traditional ways of distributing information too, and maybe this is a bit out there, but get a printing press for your library. They're actually really hard to run. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's easy, but and it's hard to make ink and it's hard to make paper, but it's also stuff that you can do, and you can justify it now as part of a maker space. You could justify it now as a part of a book history program, and then all of a sudden, when society collapses, that's actually going to be a really useful tool for distributing precisely the information that people have been talking about. Yeah, that's my suggestion.
I'd like to comment on that. In thinking about my presentation, I didn't really include this because I don't think my ideas are very well formed, but they're sort of what is an exit strategy for something like Hotty Trust in the event that loss of power is imminent. That might be something we need to think about, is if we have this many million volumes, could we get 1 million people to each save one? Or there's some kind of distributed strategy here. There's reproduction that's made possible by the digital duplication that could be done before power goes out. You can make reprints of all of these things, for example, which takes energy and printing presses and what have you. But there's definitely there's a lot of ideas that could be developed there.
It probably won't surprise you to learn that we have a printing press, not in the university archives, but I believe Houghton Library has one. There's a press. I mean, I don't know if it's a makerspace type thing right now, but I'll take that back to Houghton. See what they say.